Well, today is Thursday. It's July 21st. The title of today's devotional is Finishing Strong, dedication of the walls of Jerusalem. Now, our scripture reading, Nehemiah chapter 11 and Nehemiah chapter 12. Now, let's look for a few moments. Nehemiah chapter 11, giving you a little bit of the background. Now, we are nearing the conclusion of our study of the book of Nehemiah, which is 13 chapters long. And I want to remind you that although the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt, the city itself was not habitable. In other words, as we read in an earlier passage in Nehemiah chapter 7, in verse 4, we read that the city was large and great, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not builded. In other words, within the walls of the city of Jerusalem, there was still the tragic testimony of the destruction of that city by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the temple was built and the walls of Jerusalem were completed. And now the challenge was for some of the people to commit themselves to building their homes and residing in the city. After all, what was a large city without a great population? Now notice with me what I'm going to describe as three segments of Israel's inhabitants that were needed to repopulate the city. You find those in Nehemiah chapter 11. Now, while with the majority of the city in ruins, Jerusalem really resembled a place of poverty more than a place of privilege. And to resettle the city, the rulers of the people determined to cast lots, and 1 out of every 10 people from Israel would dwell in Jerusalem that they might guard and protect the city, as you look at verse 1. Now, some moved to Jerusalem because the lot fell on their household, but there were others, we read in verse 2, who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah chapter 11 and chapter 12 presents us with a great list of men, some who are named and others who are known only by their deeds. And here we find the names of men and deeds that would be forgotten if it were not for God having Nehemiah record them in his word. You read in verse 6 that for the tribe of Judah there were 468 men described as valiant men. As you look at verse 7 and 8 of the tribe of Benjamin, there were another 928 men resettled into Jerusalem. Also, as you continue to read, beginning at verse 10, you'll notice that priestly families moved to Jerusalem, among whom there were 822 priests who labored at the temple. Also, there was, as you look at verse 13, an additional 242 priests. And then also in verse 14, an unusual thought that there were also 128 priests who were described as mighty men of valor. Well, there were priests who had, as you look at verse 16, oversight of the outward business of the house of God. Perhaps that's the exterior and the grounds of the temple. There were others who were charged in verse 17 with the thanksgiving and prayer. Again, in verse 19, there were another 172 priests who served as the porters or the gatekeepers of the temple. Now, those men and their families were necessary to fulfill the ministry of seeing Jerusalem restored to her glory as the holy city. Now you're going to notice in the balance of Nehemiah 11, the names of the cities where the people, particularly the priests, were settled. You've got the cities of Judah, verses 25 through 30, and the cities of Benjamin, verses 31 through 36. Now I'm going to close with this. Nehemiah chapter 12 gives a chronicle of the names of the priests and the Levites who came with Zerubbabel, as well as their lineages, and the details of the worship service when the walls of Jerusalem were dedicated, verses 27 through 47. A closing thought for you. As you read the latter half of Nehemiah 12, we appreciate the preparations that went into this day of dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, beginning in verse 27. Now, all Levites were invited to come to the city and keep the dedication with gladness. Notice, if you would, beginning in verse 27, the prominence of music during the dedication services. There were musicians who were playing instruments. There were singers. There were the sons of priests described as playing their trumpets upon the walls of the city. There were sacrifices for the dedication of the wall in verse 43 that were offered. And the rejoicing of God's people was so loud, it is said in verse 43, you can hear the joy of Jerusalem afar off. Well, today's scripture reading concludes verses 44 through 45 with the people bringing their tithes and offerings out of the fields to the temple. And we read, for Judah rejoiced for the priests and for the Levites. There we have the type of ministering to those who minister to you. I thank you for joining me. Tomorrow will be Nehemiah chapter 13, and we will conclude our study of this great book of the Scriptures. God bless.